Hey, this is Cedric Youngelman, and welcome to the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. This episode is brought to you by River, the financial institution built for all time. With 100% full reserve custody and zero fees on recurring orders, River allows you to buy and mine Bitcoin with ease. Build your Bitcoin mining fleet today with River. Plus, River offers unparalleled service and functionality, including tax optimization, entity accounts, inheritance planning, and instant buy volume. Use the link in the show notes to get started and earn up to $10,000 when you buy Bitcoin or miners at River. And for the ultimate in Bitcoin security and design, check out the Cold Card hardware wallet from CoinKite. With built-in sleep at night technology, it's the only dedicated air-gapped, ultra-secure signing device for Bitcoin. Maker of some of the most iconic Bitcoin products, such as OpenDime, Cold Card, Sats Card, Tap Signer, Sats Chip, and Block Clock, which I have on the way for Father's Day. CoinKite is a leader in security and hardware manufacturer established Block 141,000. Use the link in the show notes for a discount. Don't trust, verify. Steve Jobs has been quoted as saying, "Taking LSD was a profound experience, one of the most important things in my life. It reinforced my sense of what was important, creating great things, putting them into the stream of history and human consciousness as much as I could." Welcome to this thought-provoking episode of the Bitcoin Matrix, where we sit down with Fractal Encrypt to explore the exciting world of self-sovereignty. Today, we will delve into the controversial topics of Bitcoin and psychedelics as tools for personal empowerment and freedom. Together, we will examine the boundaries of society and the limits of the individual and discuss pressing questions around what does it mean to be a free and sovereign individual? What is the government allowed to regulate? And do you have the right to modify your own mind and the right to modify your own computer? Join us as we embark on a fascinating journey into the history, taboo nature, and potential power of these misunderstood technologies. Let's enter the Bitcoin matrix and explore these tools of self-sovereignty with Fractal Encrypt.
What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
Fractal Encrypt is a cypherpunk artist infusing software, math, art, technology, and chemistry into biological interfaces. Fractal Encrypt is best known for the Bitcoin full node sculpture. Fractal, welcome to the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited to chat. I feel like this has been a long time in the making, especially since the Bitcoin full node sculpture came out. And, I think even, I don't know when I saw that in terms of the official release, but also Knut von Holm's book, Independence Reimagined. It's all over the cover and it's phenomenal. And that book really opened my eyes to looking at Bitcoin in different ways. And I remember kind of featuring your art and thinking a lot about that deeply. So I'm really excited to jam here. I'd love to hear about your art, maybe preceding Bitcoin, and maybe kind of you could speak a little bit about your influences or your style, or however you would describe it or put it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can talk about some of the pre-Bitcoin stuff. I've basically been doing art since as far back as I can remember. I've always liked art. My parents actually sent me to some little painting classes that I remember where the guy taught me how to paint a bush in the sky. And that shit blew my mind, honestly, like to just see how you could just transform a paper into something that looked like basically, some bushes in the sky. So that really kind of just got my imagination going. Like, wow, you can kind of create worlds that don't exist. And I think I've always kind of been interested in that. So I never really had any formal art training, but I just went to all my art classes in regular school. And, I've always been a studier on my own. So I whatever I get into, I tend to just dive into and research myself. So I certainly spent a lot of time in libraries. I used to take the public buses over to the main libraries that, like, before the internet, that was kind of how we got information was, you kind of had to actually do the proof of work and search that shit out and like find it, in the Dewey Decimal System, actually go to the shelves, pull it down and bring out the dusty book and, actually bring that knowledge into yourself. And, so I spent a lot of time with a lot of art books there, just looking through stuff and, kind of what people were doing to represent things and how art was being used to tell stories and things like that, and that also really caught my attention. And I think I encountered at some point the art of ancient civilizations like Egyptians and Mayans, and how they were using kind of hieroglyphics or glyphic languages. So now you kind of had art that was actually a literal story, so it wasn't just art that was some kind of arbitrary, oh, maybe there's the artist is saying this. It was actually very beautiful art that actually had a very specific story that it was telling. And that again just kind of flipped my script in the sense of, wow, like not only can you tell stories, but you can actually be very explicit about what you're doing, and also subtle at the same time. So I just always been into art, like I said, since I was little. And then at some point, I think in the 90s, I started collecting LSD blotter art. And because I was into LSD and just the art side of it was just really cool. And like I just ran into some guy at this, it was like a Grateful Dead cover band show that they had in Fort Lauderdale. And he just sat outside with a whole bunch of these art prints. And that guy's kind of famous now in that whole blotter art scene. But coming across him, he kind of sparked my imagination. And I was like, oh, this is a neat thing. And I was always a collector. I like comics, I like records, I like books. And, so this is just a new kind of thing to collect. And so I got into it. And at some point I thought, oh, this would be neat to give to people as kind of like a holiday gift, a Christmas gift or a Hanukkah gift or something, birthday gift, something like that. It's like, oh, so I started taking like the sheets and breaking them down, because they come in like a little print that's like kind of 8 by 8 inches or something like that. It's kind of big. So I would kind of break them down to the just like 100 hit by 100 hit square and get a little dollar store frame. And then I just drew stuff around it and just basically kind of glued it onto the thing and just made this little gift for the people. And the blotter art only cost like $10 for the whole thing. So like with my dollar store frame and my blotter art thing, I had a little gift for somebody that probably cost me like $3 to create, but it was something they'd probably remember forever. Because, if it was some blotter art that maybe they remembered, it was meaningful to them. It just kind of, it was something that would kind of seem like a neat idea to me. So I started giving those out to people. Somebody was like, "Ooh, you should sell these." I was like, "Ooh, that's an interesting idea." I was like, "You think anybody would buy them?" They're like, "Yeah, I think so." I was like, "Well, where would I do that?" And there was like a music festival that was coming to town shortly thereafter. So I just ended up saying, well, hey, I'll invest a little money. I'll go to the dollar store. I'll buy like 10 or 20 of these frames and take some of my art that I have here and just drew up a bunch of pictures. And then I just basically threw them out on a blanket that day and just hope for the best, see how it goes. And actually I sold out. Like I didn't go home with a single one of my frames. Like I sold them all, and it was like, I think I sold them for 10 or $15. So I was like tripping out, because I was like, dude, I paid like $2 to make these things, or $3, and I made 15. This is amazing. It's like, and people were very appreciative about the art. Like the interaction that I had with people that were actually purchasing art was kind of different than anything I had ever experienced before. So that was very gratifying in a weird way too. Also, just that people appreciated it enough that they wanted to like come out of pocket for the money that they worked for and bring it to their homes and actually display it. Like that was kind of meaningful to me. So that, like, again, kind of triggered new thoughts in my mind. And wow, there's maybe something here, and maybe I could do something more than these little dollar store, things that I'm doing. Maybe there's like additional stuff. So then I kind of just riffed off that. I started making like blotter art jewelry, little resin things, and because it was like, oh, you can kind of wear this next to your heart, and it's something meaningful to you, and you're kind of wearing it in a place that's meaningful. And jewelry, people are, I don't know, it's kind of one of those interesting things with people. So I started doing that, and then I started doing like more intense stuff. At first they were very simple, and they got more elaborate over time. And just like how I kind of started out just throwing my stuff out on a blanket on the floor at the concert, like the pendants kind of started out very much that way. And my wife was like, you got to kind of put these in a jewelry display or something, like make these look like jewelry. They're jewelry, like make it look nice. And so now I started taking them off the floor and kind of making them look a little nicer. And you learn as you go. And now, okay, maybe you put some lights up. Maybe we get a table.
Mhm.
And at some point, uh, we actually started paying to vend at festivals. So we actually just stopped just like showing up and putting stuff on the floor, and like places actually let us put art in there as like one of the little vendors. So that was kind of a whole nother thing. So then we started traveling across the country and going to all these different music festivals throughout the summer. And it was very cool because we were able to let the art act as a vehicle so that we could see the country. We can basically travel the whole country all summer, and the art pretty much paid for the whole experience. So that was very fun to do for as long as I could do. And I definitely miss that. That's something that I think went away with the whole pandemic, was the whole music festival scene. So I think that was a really fun way to just basically get out and see the world and interact with interesting people. So that's one of the things that I hope to see making a little bit more of a comeback over as we go into the future. I think
Yeah, I
I
love
kind of
that.
got a little out there, but that's kind of some of my
No,
art
it's loved it.
history.
I loved it. Please more. I love the intersection between art and music myself. I'm kind of a big music head. I remember going to the library, well, in my shitty car, maybe not by bus, but I don't know, maybe it was by bus a few times, but I could get all these jazz albums. They had just, a huge catalog of CDs, and you could take out like 20 or 30 at a time. And I could just rip them, and I could just kind of get into them later on. And I could even grab a lot of, just music that I wasn't into because I didn't have to pay for it. And I could kind of rip that or burn the CDs and kind of explore that as well. I'd love to hear about the Bitcoin full node sculptures, how that series came about.
Okay, well, the Bitcoin full node sculptures was kind of like an extension of my previous art. Like I was kind of saying at some point, I got interested in ancient civilizations art, and like I started doing a series of drawings with psychedelics that were kind of based on some of um, the Mayan calendar schema, where it basically uses these different rings and all the encoded information. So I was using that with I made an LSD mandala, a DMT mandala, and a couple other drawings that were kind of related. Those are probably the two big ones, though. Those both probably took me about a year each to complete. And then when I got into Bitcoin, I was thinking, ooh, like because the idea behind both of these drawings, the DMT and the LSD mandala, was to kind of take it at a very base level, say, at some each of the different rings of the mandala would kind of tell a different story. So one of is kind of how does it work in the world? How do you get it? And then one of them was actually the explicit recipe from the patent. Like, how do you go through each step of the chemistry and the synthesis? And the DMT one was very similar, where it kind of takes you through, if you plant this plant, here's how you could go through the extraction process and recrystallization, and kind of basically encode all this information within the drawing. So that way, if they ever take the internet from us, whatever it is, like we actually have all this information just encoded graphically. Kind of a different sly roundabout way, I suppose. So the Bitcoin full node was basically just an extension of, in essence, the LSD mandala, kind of the idea of, let's take these base primitives, see how this whole thing works, and then try to kind of see if it fits into any kind of cosmology. And in fact, like Bitcoin is extremely beautiful because it's not like some of these other things where they're chemistry molecules and tend to be certain random things. Like there's a lot of things in Bitcoin which are very explicit, and they work out very interestingly when you plot them out graphically. So that's one of the interesting things about numbers. If you just look at them sometimes, or you're just kind of looking at them in a 2D sense, well, even 2D, if you're not kind of arranging them, but just 2D in a line, is different than, say, actually just geometrically arranging things. So you can get information kind of just by creating maps. So that was one of the interesting things I found by creating the Bitcoin full node, was that I learned Bitcoin better because I wanted to teach it to other people. So I was kind of using the art as a tool to teach myself and then also teach other people about Bitcoin. So I think it's definitely was a really rewarding thing, because not only did I have the experience of just kind of creating the design, so like what did it say in it, but I did a series of 10 different pieces. So I got to experiment on doing different mediums and kind of growing as an artist as well. So not only did I get to do it once, but I got to kind of re-express it in a bunch of different ways. And I felt like each different version of the mandala kind of speaks a different language, and they're kind of like their own piece in a way. So even though they're all cohesive and they all actually basically say the same thing, they're just kind of set to different block heights. Um, I just felt I grew so much over the process of doing it. It pretty much took me 3 years from the time I got the idea, which was basically at the Bitcoin conference in 2019 in San Francisco, until I actually finished the 10th one, which is pretty much I think last year. So last summer was when I actually finished the last one. So there was a lot of growth personally for me, both, just as a person and then also as an artist as well. So um, it was just really cool to get to do that whole series. So um, yeah.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
that's a little bit about it.
I was lucky enough to see one, I think in person in Miami at maybe Bitcoin 2022. Not sure if
Was
it
it
was.
wood or mirror?
Oh, oh man. Oh, I was at 21 as well. Maybe I
Oh,
saw
okay.
it
Yeah,
both.
yeah. The 21, I had the
Um,
mirrored version, and then in 22, I had the wood version. So there's two different ones that I was able to display there, which was
yeah,
really
I
great.
think I remember the wood one more because later and I probably spent
Nice.
more time with it.
Yes.
Um, it's stunning. It's a masterpiece. I'm sure all of them are, the whole series. And I mean, just the symmetry, the appealing visual nature of it. Obviously, Bitcoin lends a lot of beauty in numbers and the math to it, but you had to envision this, conceptualize. I'm kind of really curious at what point, what was it like to feel that you were done? Because to crystallize it is to, almost come to some sort of perfection because it's going to be set and it works. That's what I'm saying. It looks perfect. So, but so what was that feeling like, or that moment, or did you ever question it, or?
That is such a crazy question, because really, I don't think an artist ever feels like they're done with something. And that was one of the beauties of doing it as a series of 10, because I actually did iterate the design in between each one because it was like, ooh, like I could do this better, or maybe I wanted to see something like this. And in fact, number 1 through 3 were basically based on the same design as the first one. So when I kind of created the first one and said, okay, I'm done, again, it took quite a while. Like I said, I started in maybe July, and I don't think I was actually like finished with the design work until around Christmas of that year. So it was basically half a year of just basically doing design work without even cutting any wood or cutting the first piece. So just getting to that point of, okay, I think I'm like done in quotes, took quite a while, but I think there was never a sense of like, ooh, maybe there's something I can't do better, because there's always, I think like each time you do it, you kind of grow and learn, like I was saying, but it's also like you yearn to see what else you could do. Like, oh, maybe there's something more I could do or something different or better. So I think like the beauty of doing a series of 10 that also didn't have to be identical was very transformative to me, as an artist as well, because it gave me a lot of room to grow and a lot of room, like I didn't have to do the same thing. And as I was saying, the first 3 were based on the identical design, but when I wanted to do the fourth one, I think I spent another 6 or 7 months going back to the design board and just saying, okay, like I need to redo this. And I in essence kind of reworked the entire design. So there's a pretty big difference, even though they may look very similar to other people. Like there's a pretty big difference between the first 3 and then the later ones in the series. I never really diverted too far from that second design. Once I kind of completed that was more holistically, I think, where I felt done-ish. But each time I did it, I kind of had to change things about it. When I moved from making it just straight on out of wood, laser cut wood, to doing it on mirror for the first time, I thought it was going to be an easy transition. I thought, okay, you have the laser, it's going to do the exact same thing, but mirror is an entirely different thing than wood. Like, so it took me months of just working with this stuff, just the new material, and figuring out how can I work with this? How can I make it look good? And then once I had some things that I thought was working good, I realized like, okay, like this means you have to actually go into your design and change a whole shitload of stuff to make it work now with this. It's still gonna look basically the same, but you're gonna And just by going in and doing that, some things are changing little parts, and it just feels like holistically each time it gets just a little better and a little better. So I just really enjoyed going through the process and each time and kind of being allowed to do that. So yeah.
Sure. I mean, it's very freeing having sort of license to do what you want. I relate in the sense that I took a break early on in my corporate accounting and audit career to go to film school, and I made films, and I make content now, and I definitely know that feeling of you release something and you definitely want to make improvements, or you would change things. You see that sort of with like in film, like director's cuts. And it's interesting though in the sense that a lot of time the art, even though you want to make improvements, the art lives on its own in a singular sense that other people see it in that version or can,
Absolutely.
or
Yeah,
and it's
once you release
fun.
it.
Yeah, and it's so much fun to explore those rabbit holes of getting to hear the person's sort of studio version versus their live version versus the version they would have remixed 15 years later versus the engineer's version. And to explore the learning of your favorite artists do, or their growth. So can you share with us where most of these 10 pieces are, who might have them, or where they are, or where we could see them, that kind of thing?
Well, each of them is in a private collection, as far as I know. That so each one of them is a private person that owns one, and only one of them is actually has asked me not to disclose who they are, and but everybody else is publicly known. A lot of them are on Twitter. The guy that bought the first one is a guy named Harry Ye, and he actually bought it at the Bitcoin conference, North American Bitcoin conference in January of 2020. He actually saw it, and he was like, "Oh, what is this?" And I was like, "Well, this is, an art sculpture." And I explained it to him. He's like, "I'll take it." I was like, "Really?" He's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Okay, but I only have," I told him I want a Bitcoin for it. He's like, "Okay, well, I only have half a Bitcoin now. Can I give that to you? And then I'll come back and give you some later." And I was like, "Okay, that's more than fine. Deposit with me. I think we could work with that." And so, yeah, after that, so that was pretty much displayed and sold in less than 24 hours. So that kind of was what started the whole thing. Then the number two one was bought by a guy named Charlie, and he's on Twitter at Charlie Holmes, I think. And then the number third one was bought by a guy named Nosy at Nosy, also on Twitter. The fourth one was bought by a guy named at Satoshi's Ark. He bought that on the Scarcity auction. So that was the first one of that, the new design. When I redesigned the fourth one, that was the very first one of that new design. So he got that one. Number five was Michael Saylor has number five. Eric Weiss has number six. Number seven is owned by Lewis Hugh, and he's got the mirrored one, and he's also on Twitter. Number eight is owned by a gentleman in Germany. He's also on Twitter. He's at Protagonist4 now. And then the next one is the guy that doesn't want me to disclose him, and then the number 10th one is owned by Ricardo Salinas.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So I get 10, but why not 21?
Well, I was actually gonna just make one. Like originally, when I was gonna make it, I had pretty much finished the design work. Like I said, I didn't have any pieces cut, and I was just showing it to Crypto Graffiti, who's another Bitcoin artist, and he was kind of giving me a lot of mentoring in that early stage and a lot of advice, and still now he does. He's a genius guy, and he was like, "You shouldn't just do one of these. You should do a series." And I was like, "Really?" I was like, "I've never done that." He's like, "Yeah, you should do a series of 10." I was like, "Oh, someone will ever buy 10 of these from me?" Like, I don't know if I could do that. He's like, "Just yes, just." So like I did the 10 because I just didn't know if that many people would ever want to get one of those. So yeah, maybe there was room to do 21, but once I kind of did the first one and said one of 10, then I just, figure we stick by that. We'll do the hard cap like Bitcoin. And
Wow.
other additions I'll play around with, but that just happened because of Crypto Graffiti was kind of just that little one comment, change your whole life.
I already think it's on the Mount Rushmore of Bitcoin art. The only other thing I could think of to put up there right now, maybe the block clock is, just an awesome
yeah,
piece of work. I really want to turn to Bitcoin and other tools of self-sovereignty. You put out this fascinating piece in Citadel 21, volume 18 in 2022. Well, July 21st of 2022. Bitcoin and Psychedelics. I guess first, before we really get into it, I mean, we're going to talk primarily about LSD and what most people call mushrooms. Just to make sure I'm saying this word right, how do you say psilocybin? Is that correct?
I'm not
Is that
100%
what we're
sure
going
how
to
it's
go with?
pronounced, but yeah, we can go with psilocybin.
All right.
I will say that.
Is there another version you would go with, or
I say
have heard?
psilocybin is how I normally.
Psilocybin. Okay.
Psilocybin is how I usually think about
All
it.
right. So
Psilocybin.
we'll go with that.
Correct.
So we have, some interesting questions to kind of maybe ask rhetorically at first, but do you have the right to modify your own mind? Do you have the right to modify your own computer? What are your rights and what is your own? What are the limits of society and what are the limits of the individual? So why are Bitcoin and psychedelics simultaneously, maybe the most powerful yet least understood technologies? Maybe just to kind of get into it a little bit. How do you
I'd
see them
love
as
to.
tools of sovereignty? Yeah.
Well, it in so many ways, Bitcoin is a tool of sovereignty in the financial sense, but in other ways, for many Bitcoiners as well, it changes the way that they think. But psychedelics as well is a tool that people can use by themselves without having to go to any trusted third party or any intermediary, and just learn about themselves. Just get real input from themselves, think about it deeply, and see where they are in the world. How do they truly feel about certain things? Sometimes you don't need a psychedelic to think about these things, but I think that it kind of confronts you with some of these questions, whether you're prepared to ask them or not, which is many times beneficial. But I think both of these are tools that people can use. And I also think they're tools of self-sovereignty because they're tools, like I said, that you can kind of use at home without anybody's permission. In some sense, I guess everybody has different laws in different countries, so you have to be aware of all that. But in a sense, these things are something that you can kind of spin up on your own. You can spin up your own Bitcoin node. You can kind of grow your own mushrooms or something, and take control over these experiences from the very beginning to the end, and kind of really incorporate this into your life rather than just something that you encounter peripherally, because a lot of times they take a little deeper investigation. Things like Bitcoin and psychedelics, like if you come across them just peripherally, in most cases, your experience of them will not be reflective of all the nuance that happens inside them. So, when you take time to actually look a little deeper, I think a lot of people will be surprised at the depths that they can find between the two.
Yeah. I mean, you go on to write there complementary revolutionary technologies that can be leveraged for profound personal growth. They help us to define self-sovereign boundaries in our lives when it comes to questions about who has dominion over the things we think, the software we use, and the actions we take. They can be used to mold the future of the individual and, by extension, the world. Many are using these tools today to create a better, more productive life. So, I mean, just quickly, are these tools for everyone? I mean, even Jameson Lopp has, famously, tweeted, nobody understands Bitcoin, and that's okay.
Sure. I mean, I would say these tools are probably not for everybody, like, and in a sense, that's not necessarily I think the common line is that people want to say, oh, everybody can use everything. And I think that some people will use Bitcoin, some people won't use Bitcoin. Same thing with psychedelics. Some people will use them, some people won't use them. And I don't think that that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing at this time in human history. I think like everybody's kind of finding their own path with these things. And I think psychedelics and Bitcoin are both very personal decisions, and they shouldn't be taken lightly. It's something that, if you're going to get into them, you should kind of know what you're doing. Bitcoin, if you're not kind of paying attention, it's easy to slip up and, make mistakes. And these mistakes are very costly. And you can have a similar situation with psychedelics. If you're making mistakes with psychedelics, they can be very costly, whether psychologically or other avenues of your life. So these are systems that have consequences if you join them. So it's something to think about deeply before you do embark upon them. But the same thing is that you can't get the benefits that these tools offer without actually using them. You can read about them, you can kind of like hear other people talk about them on a podcast and things like that. But there's no one that's going to be able to tell you what the experience is like until you actually have that experience. You know, it's like, you know, if you haven't had sex, you can't tell somebody what that feels like, or, you know, hey, what is orange? You know, it's hard to convey even something as simple as that. So I think for each person, it's something they have to discover on their own. Whether they even want to embark on it. You know, the same thing like Bitcoin, it has consequences. There are a lot of benefits. You can become a lot more self-sovereign. You can be your own bank. You can be responsible for yourself, but not everybody is prepared to be responsible. So, you know, and I've learned hard lessons. So I guess the other side of that is, you know, sometimes the hard lessons are the ones that you retain the best, and they help you to guide you to a better future. So I certainly have made plenty wrong turns and many mistakes that kind of had led me to more critical thinking, where you have to say, okay, from a first principles view, how is this path in my life turning out? Is this something I actually want to continue down, or do I want to kind of veer off here and go somewhere else? And many times that's very valuable. I think that's one of the values of psychedelics, is they kind of allow you to get a perspective shift, you know, in the sense that when you look at someone else, it's easy to tell whether they're doing fucking up, or, oh, you're messing up, man. Can't you see what's going on? But at the same time, it's hard to see when you are fucking up and you're messing up. So the psychedelics kind of give you a perspective shift where you can actually kind of look at your own self and make a barometer of whether you're fucking up or not. And if you are, you can come to terms with that and say, hey, why am I doing this? And then there's whole like rabbit holes that you can go into with that. And I think there's a lot of growth that you can have as a person through going through these personal rabbit holes and investigating yourself and what your place in the world is. And you know, and doing this in a personal way without having intermediators or someone to tell you what your place is in the world. You know, you find it for yourself.
Right. That being said, can we achieve asymmetric returns with psychedelics?
Definitely. I mean, that's almost unquestionable as far as I'm concerned. The thing is the people that pay attention and use them in a more advanced way. Like, again, if you have very peripheral experience with these things, either Bitcoin or psychedelics, you're going to tend to use them in a less experienced way. But the more experience you become with them, the better user that you become of these softwares or these technologies or these tools. So as you become better at using them, you become more adept and you become more used to, I guess, working within them. And that familiarity is going to be where you can kind of enter these flow states where, for instance, maybe you're working on something or you have a problem or that you're thinking about, and you kind of bring that problem into the experience. So you can kind of look at it holistically, maybe from these different perspectives, the perspective shift that I was saying. And many times you can actually benefit from that. So that's where these asymmetric gains can come from, is that you're kind of just thinking outside of the box or making connections that you wouldn't make otherwise. And you're doing it a lot quicker. So, you know, and at least for me, that's how it works. Again, I can't say that everybody kind of experiences the same way. But in that article that you're referencing, I did give some good examples, some before psychedelics were even illegal. For example, in the early 60s, there wasn't a lot of stigma because, oh, it wasn't illegal, so there was nothing wrong with doing it. So when they had given it to a whole bunch of professionals that kind of had been stumped, you know, the prerequisite for joining the group was that you had to have a problem that you've been working on for weeks. It has to be complicated, and you don't have a solution yet. And so they put these people through the process, and I think it was just basically one LSD session, as far as I know. And from that one LSD session with all these different, they had mathematicians and artists and all kinds of different individuals involved in this study, but they ended up with a whole bunch of concrete results from that study. And that was extremely interesting to me to see that, oh, you know, before we had this stigma, we had this social thing where the government was telling us, oh, this is poisoning us and it's bad for us. It was actually showing that it was helping people solve problems that they couldn't solve before, like demonstrably. Like, we actually had scientific proof of this. So it was, you know, it just made me think, like, maybe the sources of information that we are looking for are something that we really need to fully examine. So these are some of the things that I bring up in the article. Just always look at your sources, and don't even trust me, you know, always go out and verify.
Yeah, speaking of sources and verify and don't trust, verify, do your own research. So I think we can stipulate no one fully understands how these things work. No one's, you know, at the bottom of the rabbit hole or both of these rabbit holes. But you know, you talked a little bit about I think the LSD and DMT mandala earlier before that you created. Um, so maybe going a little bit more into that, what is the source code for LSD and psilocybin fully, freely available and understood or able to be researched?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so the source code of both LSD and psilocybin are actually totally open source in a sense. So the patents for LSD that they originally came up with are actually published, and anybody could just look those up online, and you can actually fully see how to start with carbon and end up with, LSD at the end. And so the steps are fully out there to do that. Obviously, there's a lot of watch on some of those things, so it tends to be difficult both in obtaining the precursor chemicals to do that and then also obtaining the knowledge to do that. But that doesn't the same thing is there's also similar barriers to entry to something like Bitcoin coding. So the people that are actually coding the Bitcoin development software and actually making that, usually those are somebody that's kind of put in additional time or interest into several areas of their life that have allowed them to actually get to that level of understanding where they're doing those things. Now, psilocybin is kind of the other side of that coin. So LSD, I kind of feel like in a sense it's a very specialized thing where you only have a couple of people that are kind of doing that per the amount of people that may be experiencing it. Whereas psilocybin is on the other end of that spectrum. Mushrooms are something that almost any 5-year-old could grow. It's extremely easy to do and proliferate. Anybody can get spores and kind of just put them on earth and grow some mushrooms. It's actually something extremely accessible to most people, and also it's relatively quick, and also even though it's relatively quick, there is some time involved, and also so that time involved in the process is time that you kind of are connecting to this bringing of potential life, bringing some like a spore, which is potential, into the kinetic, actually, like, the spores kind of germinating and growing into these things, and then it becomes life, and then you kind of like take this life into yourself and it changes you in some way. It's a very very interesting kind of process to go through. Terrence McKenna used to have a saying. I don't know whether it was true or not, but he said, like if you're eating mushrooms that you grew, it's kind of like riding first class on the airplane. They treat you a little better or something. It's like you kind of have this connection to them. You've been kind of with them since before they were even potential energy, and you've kind of been with them through all this time. So you kind of, they're a little gentler with you in some sense. So, or there's a connection between you and them. So I think that alone is a very deep thing to be able to kind of build your own tools. So Bitcoin allows you to build your own tools. Psychedelics allows you to build your own tools. These are tools that you can use to grow and investigate yourself and kind of become a better person, all around. So I do think that these things are open source and freely available to people that want to look. Unfortunately, we do have some, there are prescriptions against certain molecules in certain places in the world. Everybody's different, and, how they approach that.
Yeah, I will agree. I mean, homegrown, probably anything is better. And if you grow it yourself, you're gonna be more connected the time you put into it. I mean, I definitely have experience growing things, and though I want to ask, like, who created LSD? What is it? Is it natural or synthetic? Do we consider it man-made?
Okay, so this is its own rabbit hole now. Like, the official story is that it's created by a gentleman named Albert Hoffman, and that in 1938 it was synthesized like they were basically investigating a series of these lysergic amides through looking through for basically it wasn't exactly a migraine thing, but they're looking for circulatory stimulants, and they were not interesting when they initially tested it in 1938, and then in 43 eventually they went back and resynthesized some. I'm highly skeptical of this whole story. I actually have I have a little bit of this article that touches on it, and a whole Twitter thread on my conspiracy theory about the LSD origins. But where it comes from is kind of unrelated to all this conspiracy. That's not really like relevant to where it comes from. Where it comes from is just it's a natural it comes from a fungus called ergo, which is Claviceps papali or Claviceps purpura, and this grows on wheat or cereal grains, something like that. So it basically in essence, you take these these fungi that grow on the wheat, and they would put them in a petri dish. They kind of grow it out. They see if they can get some that kind of react in a black light, and if they do, then you can grow that out in a liquid culture. And then once you liquid culture it, then you can in essence kind of convert that into ergoamine, and then from there you can basically um, roll it out into LSD, recrystallize it, and then in essence it just comes from natural sources.
Got it. So, do you think psychedelic users are interconnected globally like the Bitcoin network?
I mean, for sure. I mean, in essence, I think psychedelics have probably connected humanity for as long as humans have been here, if not longer. I think we've always probably known about certain plants that will change our consciousness. And it's probably just you have certain parts of humanity that have known this for a long time and kind of passes information on. And you have a lot of times where this gets forgotten and people have no idea that certain plants or things do things anymore. So I think this kind of information has come and gone over time, but it's something that has been there a long time. At this point, it's absolutely undeniable. Just if you just probably look at the worldwide distribution or like a weekend consumption of LSD, I'm sure globally it's probably a huge amount. At least I would hope so.
Right. So then, what is there misinformation or and or FUD around psychedelics? I remember growing up that I was always told in like early on in high school, like if you do LSD, man, you're gonna turn into a glass of orange juice for the rest of your life. You're gonna
Absolutely. Well, I would say with psychedelics, there's more misinformation than there is good information. In terms of like quantity, you probably have a good about 80% misinformation and 20% good information. And it's probably getting more and more of, we're probably getting a larger amount of good information now than we've ever had. But there's two reasons for this. One, it's purposeful. So there's purposeful misinformation where, maybe a government doesn't want people to use psychedelics for different reasons. Maybe it's not, in line with the company party thinking or whatever it is, or dangerous in other ways. So they don't want that. And then there's like misinformation that's not purposeful, like you were saying, kind of where you run into people and they're kind of spreading myths like, oh, if you do LSD 7 times, you're going to be legally insane. And, all these things like that, like, or, oh, the chromosome damage was something that actually did come from the government. But there's all these kind of false narratives that surround psychedelics, and they go so far back that many people can't tell what's true and what's not. And there's so many layers of people repeating bad stories over and over again that again it becomes very clouded and very hard to discern what information is good and what information is not good. And that's part of the reason why I wrote that article, was because I kind of wanted to act as a link. In fact, like it's a deeply linked article. So if you're going through the article, there's every paragraph has links to external information, because I'm very much a don't trust verify type person, and I know other people are as well, and they'll want to go see the source material. So that was one of the reasons why I put that together, was kind of to filter through a lot of what I felt was the good material and actually present that to people so they could find it in a way without having to sift through volumes of what may be misinformation as well. So I definitely think there's misinformation. It's the same with Bitcoin. There's probably more misinformation about Bitcoin in the public sphere. If you look at, say, for example, like mainstream media articles, most of them don't get the nuance or, say, the depth of what they should be actually saying. In fact, sometimes they get it so wrong that it's embarrassing. And you have the whole New York Times thing where they have to stop the presses, and so you have, I guess, all sides of it.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Do you think Bitcoin and psychedelics are antidotes for wrong think?
No, unfortunately. It would be great if we had a magic bullet and you could just say, oh, everybody that took LSD was a perfect person and everybody that used Bitcoin was not a shitcoiner. But it doesn't work like that. And in fact, it doesn't there is no magic bullet at all. In fact, like both psychedelics and Bitcoin have avenues of wrong think that you can go down, and I just gave some examples with the shit coining. Bitcoin, you can kind of end up in all these places where people will tell you, oh, this is faster than Bitcoin. Bitcoin is boomer tech, it's old, it's slow, it's this and that. And you could easily fall for a lot of this hype that happens out there, and you don't actually understand that these people are not telling you this for for your benefit. They're telling you this for their benefit. They're actually, there's actually a very scammy reason that they're doing this. And, psychedelics have a very similar dark side where there's people that will be predatory and prey on people, because of psychedelics or through psychedelics. So it's, it doesn't automatically make you a good person. There's no magic bullet. And you certainly can't trust other people just because they say they're a Bitcoiner, or they say they use psychedelics or something like that. It's not a good litmus test. Although I do find that if you meet people that are Bitcoin only type people, and they legitimately are, I do find that to be a good filter. Those people have already kind of done some kind of acid testing, not in the LSD sense, but the acid testing of their mind to actually arrive at that Bitcoin only position. So it's not just, oh, I'm a Bitcoiner, but when you meet those people, that's like, oh, I'm actually Bitcoin only. They've kind of gone through a little filtering. Now there is the orange washing phenomenon where people will try to orange wash themselves and pretend to be Bitcoiners. So there's always the wolf in sheep's clothing. So you always have to kind of don't trust, verify, but these little mind filters do help, I suppose.
Sure. I'm thinking about, are psychedelics wholesome and teach good family values?
I think they're absolutely wholesome. There's nothing not good about psychedelics. It's actually, psychedelics are completely neutral. Really, like the main variable I think is us. So what, I say Bitcoin is a constant and LSD is a constant. The main variable is the human. So it's your personal body chemistry, what you went through that day. Are you happy? Are you sad? All these things play into the experience, and all these things are very critical. So I think that you can't take the person out of the tool. In essence, it's basically a matter of figuring out for that person how they can use this tool to best kind of grow themselves and actualize themselves.
Right. So then I think we've talked a little bit about, psychedelics can help us transform ourselves. What about our relationships?
I guess it's unique for everybody. I do think it's extremely good for relationships, in my opinion, because I think it gives people a lot of it gives me personally some empathy, because it kind of helps me think in terms of, what would it be if I was this person, in a different way than maybe if I was not on a psychedelic. I think it gives me a much clearer kind of window into other people, if that makes any sense. So I do think that there's something there that kind of transforms our relationships and the way that we interact with each other, because you can do this in a positive way or a negative way. You could have some people that will analyze this and say, oh, these are the things I'm doing wrong, this is what I could do to better my life. And then you'll have some people that will analyze it and say, oh, these are the ways that I can manipulate the situation to come out better. So and it's kind of where you are in your own personal path. Like, I'm not saying one way is right and one way is wrong. It's just everybody's got to find their own path. And I think these things confront you with it. They at least put it front and center, so it becomes at least a little more apparent.
Right. And what are safe spaces for psychedelic use?
I'm not sure that they really exist today, but I do have a concept that is a very old concept, actually, by Hakeem Bey, of the temporary autonomous zone. This is basically like little areas of non-interference. So, okay, we're going to create a temporary autonomous zone where it's going to be, and temporary autonomous zones are what they are, like in the sense of being temporary. And you could think of like a Burning Man or something like that. Like, okay, we're going to build this temporary autonomous zone where, in essence, this is a vessel for creativity and change and art and whatever it is, and we're kind of not going to fuck with it too much. Like the government kind of lets it go down and doesn't mess with it too much. Yes, if things get out of control, they'll do whatever they do, but you create these zones where they're kind of low interference, and these are kind of, in essence, like melting pots where new things can come out of. So I think that this is a very powerful thing, and I think like the interaction between computers and psychedelics brings together interesting people. And I do want to see kind of more interactions between the people that are interested in these two things. I do think that that's going to just lead to more and more things that I personally would find interesting. So I do find the combination of these to be very intriguing, and that the other people that are interested in these similar things to also kind of lead to paths that I find interesting as well. So I do kind of hope to see like more of that kind of arise, I guess, in the community, like as time goes on.
Sure. You also note in the piece that There's interesting evidence that psychedelics increase brain activity and activate new pathways and connections throughout the brain. So, if this is going on in the individual, what do you think the impacts would be on sort of modern civilization?
Right. That was actually pretty amazing to see some of the science with the increased brain activity because right, if that's kind of what's happening in an individual level, when you unleash these things in a community, then you have the macroscopic, what as above, so below. So what's happening kind of in our brains will happen in the communities as well. So I definitely think that unleashing these tools is kind of creating new pathways and new connections through the human network, as it were. So, like there's people today that are connecting because of psychedelics or because of Bitcoin that just, they don't have other commonalities or other interests, but these things kind of bring them together. And when you have these kind of things standing in the center, there's pillars around them that tend to be interesting. So like these pillars would be other areas of interest. So economics, mathematics, geometry, chemistry. You tend to find these people are versed within some of these other interesting educational paths that give them these perspectives that are very valuable because they kind of come from a place that's outside of the mainstream kind of vein. So when you have all these different connections that are creating within this human network, it just leads to additional kind of opportunities for growth, which is the same as what happens in your brain. So when you're connecting things in your brain, you can grow because you're just having new thoughts. You're just kind of making new connections and this is basically undeniable now. We have the science to prove it, and that just is what it is.
Right. We kind of gone over a bit about how LSD is more centralized than say mushrooms, and mushrooms are more decentralized. But it's interesting to note part of that pyramid form is because a single gram of LSD contains 10,000 doses. We've also talked a little bit about how LSD and mushrooms are not toxic, but are either of them habit forming?
I mean, I guess for each individual, that would be something that they would have to kind of look at. But I would say they're not habit forming in the traditional sense of something, say, like a cigarette where you're using cigarettes every day or something like that, or multiple times a day. Most people won't do that. There's some people that will say, oh, I love DMT. It's like, oh, well, when's the last time you did that? 1976, something like that's like, it's certainly not something that they are doing constantly, but it is something that had such a profound effect on their life that, 35 years later, they're still talking about it. But you will certainly have people that will tend to do it more often than others. Also, there's different types of psychedelics. So I tended to like keep a narrow focus in terms of what the article was discussing, and because LSD and psilocybin tend to be very kind of focused in a sense, and I would not consider those to be habit forming. But there are kind of like things on the fringes of that, say like MDMA or something like that, which can tend to be like more habit forming in the sense that people might want to do it a lot more often. And part of the reason is because it's just not as challenging psychologically. Like LSD will really put you through the ringer. You're going to go through like a whole roller coaster of emotions and your whole life, and you have to actually look at yourself in the mirror and this is a good person. Like MDMA is like not that, it's much more gentle, and so there's a lot more willingness, I think, for people to kind of go to those places, whereas the psychedelics, like there's a sense of finality in that, like once you take this, it's like that's it, there's kind of no coming back from it. And you kind of, once you've done that, you kind of have to see where it goes. And I think most people won't kind of do that in a way that's like habit forming, in a sense like, oh, every day I'm gonna do this. And in fact, I think just the pure pharmacology of it wouldn't allow that because of tolerance. I think LSD tolerance is such that if you tried to do it every day, it just actually wouldn't work. So as far as being habit forming in those ways, no, I think it's certainly not.
So to also put things in perspective, how would you compare the safety aspect of LSD and mushrooms to say something like aspirin?
Funny enough, they're magnitudes of order safer. I don't think there's any human recorded deaths from LSD that are known. And that's, people are consuming millions of doses every weekend for decades, so it's a pretty good amount of history that we have in terms of determining whether something's safe or not. Well, for example, I always like to tell people, if you're going to take something, you kind of want to take something that's been around for decades and people have tried it, and whether it's like gonna have like general negative effects or not. And the only way to know that is if it's been used over a long population for a long time. So LSD has been around since the 40s at least, and widely used since the 60s. And then it went through periods of disuse, and then I think in the 90s it went through a pretty big resurgence there. So it's pretty well tested in terms of, is this safe or not? And then when you compare it to something like aspirin, I think 3,000 people per year die from aspirin. So I just compared it to LSD where you have zero. I think I'm I would imagine, I've never ever heard of a mushroom death or either, like a psilocybin mushroom death. There are deaths from misidentifying mushrooms. So if people like eat mushrooms that they don't know are psilocybin mushrooms and they have misidentified them, they can get poisoned, or certainly you could probably die as well. But from the actual like LSD or psilocybin themselves, they're probably not much safer substances on the planet. And part of this is because of their similarity to just our body neurochemicals. So like your serotonin chemical is extremely similar to both LSD and psilocybin, just the way that they look molecularly. They're basically like mirrors in a sense, and that's why they fit. They're almost like keys that fit into the same locks in our mind, and that's why they do what they do. But because of that, they're just extremely safe, and our body just knows how to process them because they're very familiar with the structure, and metabolizing it's like no big deal. Like, so it doesn't show up in like urine tests and things like that because your body just metabolizes these things very quickly and safely.
Hmm. So, can someone trip out from like yoga or meditation?
I don't I don't have a lot of success personally with yoga or meditation, but what my point I think like my main thing with yoga and meditation is that I just don't like when people say like, for example, you could get what you get from LSD out of doing other things. Couldn't you get what you get from LSD from doing other things like yoga or meditation? I just completely reject that. Like, there's just no, like, these are different things. And in fact, you want them to be different things. Like, if you're meditating, you kind of want to know that you're, like the act of taking a drug is actually very good because you know that you're kind of defining this part as like, okay, I'm kind of breaking for reality for a while. There's going to be a certain time amount, it's going to go away. And yeah, there's no replicating that through other means. So I think people that will try to tell you that don't know what they're talking about, and I don't think that that's a good argument at all. So that's that's my thoughts on that.
Right. And from your research and experience, what have you seen with mushrooms and their effect on depression and anxiety?
I I don't know too much about mushrooms and depression and anxiety. I do think that there's a lot of studies going on with that, but I'm not too knowledgeable about that to be honest.
Sure. I think Brian Murrescu, he noted that, he's seen effects in, like very quickly, not just positive changes in attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs, but fundamental psychological change in an afternoon. Even a few years after experiments, 75% of volunteers still report that their one and only dose of psilocybin remains one of the most meaningful experiences of their entire lives, if not the most meaningful experience. I think this came out of a study at Roland
That's
Griffith's
Roland
work at,
Griffith.
yeah, John
Yes,
Hopkins University.
this
That
wasn't depression. This wasn't depression. So this is actually a Roland Griffith study. He was seeing if like mushrooms could evoke the same type of mystical experiences that people had reported over the years, like famous mystics from religion and history. And their science in essence just proved that yes, the mystical states that are produced by psychedelics are almost indistinguishable from what are reported from the ancient mystics. And Brian Marescu's quote that you just gave there was absolutely astonishing when you think about that, where 75% of the people that were in this study, even 3 years later, say that this was a fundamental transformative moment in their life. And this just one experience that's just extremely powerful. It just shows that I think Terence McKenna has a quote that says, going to the grave without having a psychedelic experience is like going to the grave without ever having sex. It's like you're just kind of missing out on this one facet of life, and there's no way to kind of tell you what this is, or you just have to actually experience it for yourself. And it's not for everybody, and it's not without risk, but there's no way to find out if that if that's for you without actually going in. But the thing is you don't have to just go in willy-nilly. Like you can actually, there are safe ways and there are safe protocols to do this. So if you can obtain, for example, some good mushrooms or some good LSD, you don't have to just go ahead and eat like a full dose out of nowhere, like, and just that's your first time. You can actually just kind of work your way into it slowly. So there's no rush to it. So if you have a good supply, you can actually just take your time over weeks or months and just kind of take really small amounts until you start to feel it and kind of work your way into it. And I think that these type of gentle kind of exposures to it tend to be a little more welcoming. There is value in just jumping off the deep end. I'm not saying that that's not valuable also, but it's not for everybody. So I'm just saying that there's different ways to go about this, and it's not always that you just have to do one and done type situation. These things you can actually work yourself into, and even if you don't fully go through a full psychedelic experience on some of these trips, you're kind of working your way up to it, getting a familiarity with it, you understanding how it makes your body feel. Also, in a sense, you're doing a little allergy testing, so you know that, oh, this is good. It's not harmful in a sense. Like I've got something that's good and it makes me feel good. So those things are better to determine at very low doses than very high doses.
Sure. Is this related to why is psychedelics sometimes called entheogens?
Entheogens.
Yeah.
So the reason that they're called entheogens, the word means that it awakens the divine within. So this is very controversial. People have different feelings and thoughts about that word, but to me, it's meaningful in the sense that it gives people access again to that mystical state, whatever you call that. If it's like a sense of religious awe or ecstasy or whatever it is, it kind of gives you access to these ecstatic states that are just not accessible through other means. And I don't know if I lost the thread there.
No, that was great. And so, I want to ask these a little bit rhetorically, but what does it mean to be a free and sovereign individual? What is the government allowed to regulate? What are your rights? What is your property? What are the limits of society, and what are the boundaries of the individual? Do you have the right to modify your own mind? Do you have the right to modify your own computer? Bitcoin is a tool of information. LSD is a tool of experience and imagination. Similarly, I mean, like Ross Stevens has a quote that I think is phenomenal. You can stay on the fiat standard, in which some people get to produce unlimited new units of money for free, just not you, or opt into the Bitcoin standard, in which no one gets to do that, including you. Users of psychedelics go through, well, this is not Ross Stevens, but users of psychedelics go through similar lifestyle changes that profoundly change how they interact with the world. These can manifest in the same way as with Bitcoin, changes in how people eat, work, exercise, consume media, interact with each other, etc. These significant life changes may never have been actualized without directly using one or both of the technologies discussed in this article. Like any tool, these can be misused, abused, and lead users down the wrong path. Talking about combining Bitcoin and psychedelics, maybe a little bit more about your rabbit hole story. What was sort of the intersection there of Bitcoin and psychedelics?
Absolutely. Yeah, I guess this is good because it brings us back kind of a little to the beginning of our conversation, because the way that I got into Bitcoin was also through psychedelics and art. So it's all very much tied into the conversation that we're having here. So as I was doing this art, some of the art that I made actually was LSD blotter art. So originally I collected it, but then, as I started becoming an artist and doing art, and then I wanted to make my own blotter art too. So like I started making blotter art and doing other things like that. So at one point I had a guy that had wanted to buy a stack of the blotter art from me, but he was in Brazil, and he said, hey, will you take Bitcoin, because it's just the easiest way to send money internationally for me. And I was like, well, yeah, I would take Bitcoin, but I don't know how to do that. You have to tell me what to do. And he's like, okay, you need to set up a wallet, and you go to blockchain.info and you just set it up, and and you do this, you copy paste, send it, and I'm just going to send you the Bitcoin. And I had heard of Bitcoin, at this point it was 2015. So I had heard of Bitcoin a long time ago. I was actually on a mushroom forum where people were talking about it quite a lot back in 2010, 2011, when the Silk Road was kind of going on. Once they got busted, it became a lot more publicly known, I think, at that point. But I'd say at this point, I knew what it was, but I just had zero concept of like how to accept it, or even that it changed in value in terms of the US dollar. I didn't really understand any of this, but he just wanted to pay me in Bitcoin. I said, no problem, fine. He sent me the Bitcoin, I sent him the art, and then in essence, this guy just basically disappeared back into the internet. He's just like some cypherpunk that popped up anonymously out of the internet and just disappeared back into the internet. I pretty much just never heard from him again. And I had this Bitcoin now in a wallet, and he told me like how to like see what it was worth, but I don't think I understood that you could exchange it or anything like that. I had just no concept of what I had. And in fact, I just basically ended up forgetting about it. And I think like a year later, one of my friends was like, "Hey, do you know where I can get some Bitcoin? Because I want to get some LSD on the dark net." I was like, "Oh yeah, I do. I actually have some Bitcoin and I need to pay my rent." And so I think like Bitcoin was like $600 at the time. So the Bitcoin that the guy had sent me for the art had appreciated in value basically like 3 or 4 times at this point. And like I was like, wow, like this is only worth $400 back then. Now it's worth like almost $2,000. And so paid quite a bit of rent at that point. And I think I had like a 0.1 of a Bitcoin that was left over, which was like $10 at that time. And it was in essence change that was I didn't give to him. I just gave him the rest of what I had. And again, I just forgot about it. And the same guy called me a year or two later, which was September of 2017, and he said, "Oh, hey, you remember that $10 of Bitcoin you didn't want to sell me? You should check your account because Bitcoin's worth $4,000 now." And I was like, "What? That's not true." But I went home and I looked, and my little 0.1 was actually worth $400, and I was like, "Wow, this is insane!" Like my whole art sale was supposed to be $400, and now I have $400 again magically. Like, and I already extracted 2,000 in value. Like, what the fuck is going on here? So now I'm like paying attention, like the first 2 times, okay, I missed it. Now I'm starting to see like something's going on here. Like, how is this worth? Like, if somebody gives you $1 next year, it's not worth $2. It's certainly not worth $10. Like you're not like, so now I'm paying attention. So in September, I kind of like start watching it move from September to December. So this 0.1 goes from $400 to like $2,000. And I was like, man, like this is really crazy. And that's when I started like hearing all the narratives like, oh, Bitcoin is slow and it's boomer tech and it's slow and slow and outdated and all this stuff. And you want these other coins. And so I believed all that stuff. And in essence, like I ended up probably spending that whole 0.1 on like shit coins and doing all kinds of retarded stuff with it. So in essence, all that got lost. But like that's why I say like a system without consequences is, you don't really learn from that. So these both systems, Bitcoin and psychedelics, they have definite consequences. And in essence, you never forget that you sold 3 Bitcoin for $1,800 for rent or whatever. Like, like at one point when that was $70,000 or whatever that was like $210,000 for this art, like absolutely inconceivable, to think about these things. So the lessons are hard. You remember them. You modify your behavior in your life to make sure you don't make these same type of mistakes again. And I think it's very important. So these consequences are real, and I do think that they're valuable. And I think me personally, I've grown through using both and learning the hard way.
Yeah, I mean, similar pain and tuition costs. I want to read a bit from your piece. So in December 2017, I made my first Bitcoin art. This change in subject matter was significant for me as I view my art as a method to spread my message to the world. When I get into something, it takes over my whole life. Psychedelics had been my subject for over a decade, so this shift was monumental for me. I quickly got tricked into shitcoining, and for about a year and a half, I believed ridiculous things like Ethereum is the future of art and other equally dubious things. But as I said, when I get into something, I become consumed by it. I investigate it as thoroughly as I can. I began investigating NFTs, learning how they were coded, how they work, and the more I learned, the more disillusioned I became. Through using an array of shitcoins in combination with psychedelics, I quickly saw that I was on the path of broken promises and dead-end tech of this wasteland of shitcoinery. There was a hard line, a threshold, and I crossed it in June of 2019. While working on a hackathon project for the Bitcoin 2019 conference, I went through a psychedelic experience that drew a line in the sand. While working on a really cheesy Super Bowl commercial for Bitcoin, The resolve hit me all at once. I logged onto the exchange and dumped all my shitcoins for Bitcoin, and my art was going to be Bitcoin only from here on out. The following month, I flew out to San Francisco for the Bitcoin 2019 conference. That Friday, during the conference, I heard someone mention Bitcoin's clock and calendar-like nature. I took some LSD that evening and went to a Bitcoin developers meetup a few blocks away from my hotel. After a full day and evening consuming LSD and Bitcoin content, I spent the night sketching out the very first concept designs for the Bitcoin full node sculpture. I spent the next 7 months working tirelessly, avoiding friends, TV, Twitter, and sleeping in an endless quest to create. Here, I quickly combined Bitcoin and psychedelics with the intended desire of creating an art piece that mapped Bitcoin over time, space, mind, and the people making up the network. This process stretched out the entire 7 months, and I used LSD in different ways during this time. I found it especially helpful in two distinct endeavors. So I'd love for you to describe these two different, distinct endeavors. Start with the first one for holistic, big picture thinking. Maybe how do you frame up your usage and your approach?
Okay, there's actually so much there in terms of the history of where we came from. So I definitely want to touch on that, but you brought up some thoughts also in terms of where I've come from artistically and also just how I like to use it to spread a message. And I do think that actually, the way that I said it there kind of brought a little of the gravity better than the way I described it before, because I do take it very seriously when I'm kind of making art. It's like I feel like, yes, I'm using it to spread a message, and I do feel like that's very important and there's a responsibility there. So I tend to be very focused on delivering that message. And with psychedelics, it was the message that these are wholesome, valuable tools for humanity that are misrepresented and misunderstood, and something that people should look deeper at. And so when I found Bitcoin and I actually kind of decided to do a subject change in essence, and it really in many ways I don't even consider it a subject change, because I feel like Bitcoin is a complementary revolutionary technology just like psychedelics are. So it's just basically it's a new spin on the path that I was already on in essence. But it was pretty monumental to me in the sense of saying like, okay, like now we're going to incorporate something different to what we've been doing for the past, your whole life, in essence, the past 10 years of your life. So it was definitely a huge deal to kind of first incorporate that. But then coming from that time of 2017, there was a lot of like misdirection and me kind of doing self analysis through psychedelics and saying like, hey, is a lot of this narrative you're being told true? Is some of this stuff accurate? Is what you're being told good? And part of it was like with some of the NFT things, like as an artist, you're actually like creating these things and selling tokens, like, and really like there's nothing more shitcoiny than creating your own token and trying to sell it to other people for their Bitcoin or whatever. So like when I had realized this, it was a very, like there was a lot of like self-searching that I had to go through to come to like realization of like what is all this and where is my place in the world. And so all these things happen, like it kind of breezed through there in the article. But yeah, from 2017 to 2019 was a very deep time. And yes, that like kind of cheesy Super Bowl commercial thing was a turning point for me. I kind of had spent a lot of time and energy making like these really stupid NFT things, like, and like every weekend, like the way that the NFT market is, it kind of like it pays you to keep producing crappy continuous art like over and over again. And like I was basically like fooled into doing that over and over again like for a few months. And then at some point I just was like, look, this is absolutely ridiculous and repugnant behavior. Like, what are you doing with your life? And like, so like, yeah, then I changed, and it was kind of a big deal because like I'm seeing all these other NFT artists that I was friends with and working with at the time. And like that whole thing kind of started to blow up really big right when I turned my like said like this is not right and I'm gonna do Bitcoin only. So I'm actually like sitting here in my apartment, like not talking to anybody, watching all this NFT shit like go crazy, working on this Bitcoin mandala that nobody's seen, nobody even knows is going on, nobody cares about, nobody fucking cares, and nobody knows what I'm doing. And so months of this, so and like eventually, like finally, I release it, and people are like, the reaction was unbelievable. So like that was kind of proved to me that yes, like you're on the right path and there is some value in what you're doing, and like the market doesn't only want this retarded, stupid thing that you didn't feel good about doing anyways. Like, here's something that you could feel good about doing. It spreads a positive message, and there's something wholesome here, and there's something that the world needs. And maybe you have a way to kind of translate it that other people will relate to it. And people have told me that, sometimes, like, just seeing a picture of something is relatable in a different way than maybe reading about it. So just, it's the way that I can help, in essence, I guess.
Sure. So maybe we could talk a little bit about
I didn't get to those those 2 points that you were going to ask. Okay, so the ways that, in essence, what this led to, the ways that I was using LSD and Bitcoin in combination during this time of kind of creating that LSD mandala was 2 ways. One, I would do kind of a high dose type sessions where I didn't really care about like doing the actual work. I could almost get a little sloppy and just really like get very far out there in my mind, turn the project around, just kind of think about it in different ways. And honestly, like if I got distracted or I went somewhere totally different, that was fine. Sometimes you can't control like how this stuff goes, but sometimes magic happens, and you kind of have to open yourself up to it and kind of create the proper setting. So like nobody's going to bother you. You have time to yourself. You have the proper place, the proper amount, all these things is kind of, by setting things up, you kind of allow for this magic to happen. So, when you're in these spaces, sometimes I would do like basic sketches, or even if you just get these ideas, like once you have the vision, it doesn't go away a lot of times. That's one of the advanced uses of psychedelics, I think, is some people will take psychedelics when they're not very experienced with it. They'll have these very epiphany visions and, come to this amazing realization, but then the next morning they kind of forget about it. I find that becoming more familiar with it and being able to kind of leverage the insights that you get from psychedelics is a little more advanced use of it. And so some of these uses of combining are kind of leveraging that as well. So you have these high dose sessions that are more just, in essence, for like forming ideas on the project and kind of thinking about it holistically. Like, how do these things fit together? How does it work? And then other times you'll have the other way that I would use it is kind of like in a flow state situation where you're trying to actually do the work. So you're actually like, okay, you have your concept, you kind of know what you're doing. Now you're just kind of in front of your pencil or your computer or whatever you're using, and actually just sitting there for hours and doing whatever it is. Sometimes you could just get so lost in it that just time dissolves and everything goes away. And your wife's like, yo, you haven't eaten in 2 days. And it's like, don't bother me, woman. I'm over here making magic. And you just kind of have this feeling that things are right and you're on, and like and everything's kind of coming together correctly. And there's kind of ways that you can, like I said, set yourself up for success like this. And I do give some examples in the article about just kind of the ways that I would do the flow state. The flow state sessions would be different than a high dose session. A high dose, maybe you would just take your full amount, whatever you would like for the dose at one point. Whereas if you were doing one of these kind of creative flow state sessions, if you had what you would consider one dose, maybe you would cut that into quarters. And instead of taking it all at once, you just kind of take 1/4 and then just see how it feels. And sometimes like that's enough to get you going and you don't actually need anything more. And sometimes that doesn't do much. And like you kind of don't really need to have expectations, but kind of every hour you could just keep taking another quarter. And then a lot of times just by doing this really slow kind of over time entrance into the state, it doesn't hit you all at once. So there's not this like overwhelming shift from regular consciousness to, oh my gosh, I'm tripping. In fact, it happens kind of so slow and gently that you kind of just move into it. And by creating these kind of gentle transitions, you also kind of allow for yourself to move into these flow states a little easier, because you don't have like the body shocks or the mental shocks or anything. It just kind of all flows, and you're kind of setting up, you have all your tools of your trade, whatever you're trying to do, good music, everything kind of plays properly. And you just never can be attached to things. Like if if it works out, cool. If you don't have nothing and nothing productive happens, really, it's not the end of the world. You just have another Sunday, and it is what it is. So it's like, I think like not having attachments to it is also important, because sometimes you can kind of try to push yourself too far, and that's not productive. In a flow state, you just kind of want to, like I was saying, You just want to have that feeling that things are right and things are moving forward and things are good. And if not, sometimes you can't force it. You can kind of fake it till you make it a little, but if things aren't working, it's no problem to just go off in other directions. And sometimes other directions are where the magic happens, to be quite honest.
Sure. Magic is awesome. You have a saying, create high, edit sober. And I want to read a little bit more from your piece. Many professionals have been and continue to be too scared of professional or social repercussions due to their use of psychedelics. Luckily, not everyone is silent on this matter. Dennis Weir, a computer programmer, shared this story. Here is a way I used LSD 25 for a complex programming project in 1975. I was working in New York developing a compiler for an application language called Marlin. At one point in the project, I could not get an overall viewpoint of the operation of the entire system. It really was too much for my brain to keep all the subtle aspects and processing nuances clear so I could get a processing and design overview. After struggling with this problem for a few weeks, I decided to use a little acid to see if it would enable a breakthrough. I used only 75 micrograms because I was not interested in tripping, as I had a specific, limited, and definite purpose for the use of LSD. While stimulated by the LSD, I was able to get the entire system wholly in my mind at the same time. I spent some time mentally visualizing various aspects of the compiler, the language, and the processing which would take place. I did discover 3 or 4 design inconsistencies while being stimulated by the effect of the LSD, and I made notes for later checking. Once all the changes were made, I was able to successfully complete the programming of this huge system. The design changes I made reduced future program modification errors and contributed to the elegance of the design. The system was a commercial success for my employer and was used for many years by them. Although the use of LSD was an important component of the success of the system, no one knew of its use except for me.
That to me is just such an amazing story on so many levels, because it's a perfect description of some of the things that I was trying to say earlier, how he was able to use it to just see the system holistically in a different perspective, and he was able to make material changes that were good for his employer. But the really dynamic, he just kind of disclosed this. He just disclosed this like 20 years later on the internet, and like no one knew. And because of the social stigma, we will never know how many revelatory changes have happened in the world because of LSD, because a lot of people just won't tell you that it has anything to do with maybe something important or something, something that they thought of. Sometimes they may not even realize, but sometimes it's very, very, very plain. And I found a lot of programming examples where there was different programmers that were using psychedelics. I even found one that used it in that same exact way that I was saying, where you kind of take a quarter every hour in that very gentle way. He was basically gave a description where you say, oh, if you just take a sliver of a tab and you can end up coding and really end up in some creative spaces. And I think he also even was saying how sometimes you can just end up in a totally different place than you started, but sometimes that's kind of where you need to be anyways, project wise. Like you didn't think you needed to go here, but that's where it ends up.
Right. And there's more examples you cited, like Bill Atkinson and with HyperCard and Apple, and how that's sort of meta using tools of self-sovereignty to create additional tools of self-sovereignty.
That's super cool. How he basically used LSD and then he created something that Apple shipped to millions of households all over the planet. And like what this tool did is it let your regular person become like a desktop publisher. So it was the first kind of computer art and computer publishing tools that people had access to. So HyperCard was a huge deal. So he's creating this tool that allows people to become their own publisher, their own artist, and they never had this ability before, in a sense. And so he's giving them this tool of self-sovereignty. He created this tool of self-sovereignty by using 2 other tools of self-sovereignty, computers and psychedelics together. So his combination of the 2 led to an entirely new creation that other people were able to benefit from. And just so this goes back to that kind of what you were saying before, with the way when we have our brain is changing and making these new connections and new pathways, what happens when you unleash this on the world. So I think HyperCard's story is another amazing example of how this happens.
Right. I want to read a little more from your piece. You believe we are all capable of creating masterpieces. A car mechanic can be so good that he is considered an artist. The same applies to a chef, a lawyer, or a teacher. All these crafts can be honed to a level of mastery. Find your passion, follow it, and create your masterpieces. Using these tools of self-sovereignty, Fractal believes we can grow as individuals and cultivate the opportunity to impact the world around us in more profound ways. kind of turning a little bit towards origin stories. I mean, it is kind of, you know, there are some maybe parallels between maybe Albert Hoffman and Satoshi. Um,
There's
you noted how, we always kind of get there's
wait
the what
one
actually happened.
I was thinking the before we jump into the similarities between the segue that you just gave there, where we were talking about how um first we were talking about how hypercard allows people to, or allowed, other people to benefit from tools of self-sovereignty that were built with tools of self-sovereignty. What I was saying, trying to convey there for everybody else, is that no matter who you are and what you can do, you probably do something good enough that you can create a masterpiece at it, whatever it is. I don't know what that is. You probably know your thing. But if you kind of lean into that, in essence, like kind of I did with the art, and then kind of also point that at Bitcoin, you may find that you're able to leverage these things in ways that will lead to new things like hypercard that do change the world. So every single one of us, everybody that's listening, we all have the ability to create a masterpiece. Yours kind enough to say that about my art pieces, but I just think everybody can make art. We all just work in a different medium. We're all artists, we all just work in different mediums, and there is a big reason to go out and create. And the reason that you want to go out and create is because, in essence, you could just, this is very fulfilling. This could change your life. You just kind of want to follow your passion, what drives you in life. If you follow that, you never know where it will take you. So I figure it can't take you wrong, because it will just take you to avenues that you're already interested in. And if for some reason you find you're no longer interested in that, you just change your avenue.
Right on. So yeah, I mean, I love what you said there. And turning a little bit about to origin stories. I mean, was Albert Hoffman CIA? Was Satoshi CIA? You kind of frame things up with what actually happened, what we're told happened, and complete fabrications and misinformation about what happened. So, maybe more towards LSD and Hoffman. What do you see going on there with maybe the CIA?
Oh, well, with Hoffman and the CIA, there's some conjecture that Sandoz was a longtime CIA kind of asset. So that there was a definitely a relationship between the CIA and Sandoz, but more concretely, there was an episode in France in a city called Port.
Saint Esprit? I lost you.
In essence, where people kind of went crazy, and they attributed it to Saint Anthony's fire, which is like an ergotism. And it's basically like I was saying before, LSD comes from a fungus called ergo. So they were saying that this was an ergo poisoning, but what people actually think happened is it was a covert LSD dosing that the CIA kind of perpetrated in this French city. And there's actually a whole book about this. Hank Amperelli has a book that kind of gets deep into the Poinsett Esprit incident, and it's super interesting. So whether or not like Albert Hoffman was directly a CIA asset or not is certainly up for debate, but there's definitely these interesting connections that people have drawn, and without question, the U.S. government had put in orders for LSD from Sandoz, so there were certainly like connections there between the U.S. government and whether the CIA or not, I don't know. And the same can be said with Satoshi. So we have things like the NSA creating the SHA-256 algorithm, so people are suspicious right off the bat. And I think when Satoshi left was actually because Gavin Andresen said he wanted to go do a presentation in front of the CIA about Bitcoin. They wanted to talk to him about Bitcoin, and I was like, we never heard from Satoshi again. So like there's certainly these weird origin stories that number one, like kind of like I was saying, we have the official story, like what we're told. Then there's probably what actually happened, and then there's also misinformation about what happened. So these are extremely mysterious origin stories, but the fact is that these technologies, so Bitcoin and psychedelics, like they exist today. So like what we have to figure out is like how do these things how are these things important to me as an individual? So like where can I benefit from these technologies? Since we already know they exist, it's kind of like not beneficial, I think, to like wonder about like who Satoshi is, in essence, like, oh, who is the Satoshi? Do I have to know? There's not a lot of benefit to actually knowing that, but actually the benefit becomes like knowing how can you use Satoshi's invention to better your life. Like,
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think Terence McKenna popularized the stoned ape theory, where unthinking monkeys evolved into humans by consuming psychedelic mushrooms on the African plains. Um, don't know if that's accurate. The CIA seems to be everywhere here, from Bitcoin to LSD. I mean, MK Ultra. There's been rumors and conspiracy theories about the CIA and the Grateful Dead and the whole scene in San Francisco, which kind of brings us to the early computer revolution. And we talked about it a little bit earlier in the show, but LSD used to be legal in California until 1966. You noted one of those studies where, in this one that I have in front of me, 27 men participated in a study which included, engineers, physicists, mathematicians, architects, a furniture designer, and a commercial artist. The subjects were instructed to select one or more problems that required a creative solution, and then subjects had to work for weeks or months without being able to find a satisfactory solution before the program. And what came out of that was astonishing: a mathematical theorem for NOR gate circuits, a conceptual model of a photon, a linear electron accelerator beam steering device. This all sounds like Austin Powers. A new design for the vibratory microtome, a technical improvement of the magnetic tape recorder. Different things there.
Yeah, they have like concrete results, and it's super interesting to think that you had like a good overlap of at least 10 or maybe 12, 15 years where computer science and psychedelic science were not controversial at all to combine. So you could have had people doing both, and in fact there's a lot of evidence that there was people doing both straight all the way through the 60s. Like pre-illegalization, there was actually a group called the International Foundation for Advanced Study that basically dosed 350 very reputable scientists and engineers in the computer science industry in San Francisco. And some of these people were very influential in computers. In fact, one of them, Doug Engelbart, even invented the mouse later on. So like something that you probably have on your desk right fucking now, like these people were expanding their mind and figuring out how some of this worked through psychedelics. And it's very interesting to think that not only was it happening at the same time, but it was happening in the same geographic location. So you have this little pinpoint that happens in history that focuses right around the San Francisco Bay Area, and you have this kind of mix of both cryptography, computing, and psychedelics that happen both at the public and military levels. So there's like levels to what's going on, but it's all happening in the same exact place and time. So all these ideas are kind of co-mingling, coexisting, and entering existence together, and there's no way to unentangle them. And I think the internet itself is probably a very direct result of psychedelics and computers being combined.
Wow. Yeah, I want to read more from your piece. LSD was used at many of the top computer companies of the 50s and 60s for everything from systems design to the design of computer circuitry. Several of the early computer design engineers relied on LSD in designing circuit chips, especially in the years before they could be designed on computers, because you had to be able to visualize a staggering complexity in 3 dimensions, hold it all in your head, and they found that LSD could help. Timothy Leary, Harvard professor and well-known psychedelic evangelist, became an outspoken proponent of the power of personal computing as a tool for personal growth. He saw the personal computer as a technology that could open the mind in many of the same ways as LSD. Quote, "The PC is the LSD of the 1990s," end quote, Timothy Leary. LSD was everywhere in 60s Silicon Valley. Computer scientists, programmers, and designers from all major companies were involved. This story from Wired magazine goes into the connections between psychedelics, the internet, and the Grateful Dead. Even though this story is from 25 years before Bitcoin's birth, the following paragraph below sounds very Bitcoin-like. One part of that transaction's magic is the achievement of sharing useful content through the network over decades in time. But another, even more astonishing fact is the resilience of the data, that it held from machine to machine with some kind of life force of its own. Something inside of it made it self-replicating and alive. something begging to be copied and shared and listening to a song. And listen
That's
to.
just like Bitcoin poetry to me, you know. When I saw that quote, it was like I couldn't believe it was 25 years before Bitcoin that people had a system that had data resilience that they were using like this. And it's amazing to see how kind of Grateful Dead songs were one of the impetus for data to start moving across the internet. So it's kind of like there's just and this is before the internet. This is just like networked computers that happened to be networked in the 70s.
Right. And more from your piece, we can see that the beginnings of the computer and psychedelic revolutions both trace their roots back to this focused nexus of location and time. These rivers seem to flow into the same oceans and arise from the same sources. There are overlapping ripples between the seemingly separate subcultures brewing in the early compute and psychedelic communities. Many thinkers, authors, scientists, and researchers of the time came in close contact through social circumstances or through their occupations. The path from building tools of control for corporations to building tools for people to resist control came about over decades. So, I mean, there's just this huge nexus here of all this stuff going on. So then how does cryptography fall in line with these other revolutions that are happening? And who is Whit Diffie?
Yeah, Whit Diffie, if you ever heard of exchanging your public and private key with somebody, pretty much Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman are the two that you can thank for that. And in essence, these two heroes kind of wrestled public key cryptography out from the jaws of the military industrial complex. There was already cryptography that was happening, but most of that crypto was extremely military sensitive, and it was not publicly accessible information. And these two guys were some of the first that really started to go out and try to pull together as much of this information that they could on cryptography systems. And not only did they figure out, kind of a little of what was already going on, but they created their own, version, which now people are still using today. The public private key exchange is called I think it's called a Diffie-Hellman key exchange, actually. So it's these two guys that we can really thank for doing that. And these are the guys that pretty much brought privacy to humanity. And I think these are very interesting people to look at. And I did spend a little bit of the article kind of getting into some of their philosophies. And really, they are kind of an outcropping of what first came earlier with that 1950s, 1960s. So first we had the military industrial complex funding some really big computing projects, and also probably also funding a lot of psychedelic research as well, to be honest. So that the 50s and 60s. Now, this time where we're talking about with Hellman and Diffie is more mid 70s. So we've already had computing and things like that. So now they're able to use some of these technologies that were built. But again, we're in the same exact San Francisco Bay Area. So we have this nexus that's going on. But this work that they did was very unliked by the government. And in fact, they pretty much almost made it illegal to write code that was cryptographic in nature, and they pretty much considered it a munition. And there was something called the encryption wars of the 80s and 90s, and the original cypherpunks that probably birthed the whole Satoshi movement were pretty much radicalized through what happened during this time, where they were pretty much saying code was the same as a weapon. And so you had cypherpunks saying, no, not only is code not a weapon, but code is the way to protect ourselves. Code is the shield, not the weapon.
Yep. So, yeah, I mean, reading more from your piece, I mean, cryptography was a closely guarded secret of government intelligence agencies until Whit Diffie and Martin Hellman wrestled the secret knowledge free and gave it to the everyday man. This insolence was not without consequences. The government tried to ban encryption by labeling it as a munition of war and making it illegal to write and publish cryptographic code. Using cryptography would be the same as being a weapons dealer. This led to the encryption wars of the 80s and 90s. Here again, we find ourselves in this pinpoint nexus of time and place. The hero of our story joins the battle, changing the course of human history forever. In 1965, after leaving MIT, Whit Diffie got a job through his knowledge of psychedelics, and in 1969 traveled to, you guessed it, the San Francisco Bay Area. In 1975, he published his work on public-private key cryptography that underpins the entire Bitcoin system. And thinking about how the 60s counterculture of San Francisco shaped the entire PC industry, Quote, Diffie's job interview at the Mitri Corporation was with a distinguished mathematician and software designer named Roland Silver, who became his mentor. It was an unusual interview by military contractor standards. It took place at Silver's home, and almost the entire conversation concerned psychedelic drugs, how to prepare them, where to acquire them, etc. Diffie passed with flying colors. Diffie was also a major proponent of personal liberty and self-sovereignty. When he learned that government intelligence agencies were hiding knowledge of cryptographic mathematics, he is quoted as saying, cryptography is vital to human privacy. Maybe passionate researchers in the public sector should attempt to liberate the subject. If we put our minds to it, we could rediscover a lot of that material. These are some interesting dudes. So how does Ralph Merkle tie in with these guys?
Yeah, so that's interesting. And I even forgot that psychedelic connection with Diffie too. That was hard to find, but that was a great little piece in there, is the fact that he got his the way that he came into San Francisco was through psychedelics. So again, we have this connection between psychedelics, cryptography, Bitcoin, computing. I just find this to be fascinating how they're interconnected so deeply. Now Ralph Merkle shows up on the scene, I want to say in the later 70s. So in the earlier 70s or mid 70s, we have the public key cryptography paper from Hellman and Diffie. I think Merkle reads that paper and then kind of links up with them, and they begin doing additional work. I think RSA also sprung out of this, which is another type of cryptography. So we have Merkle trees, and we also have the RSA cryptography that all kind of springs directly out of this initial Diffie and Hellman connection. And all these people are pretty interconnected all through the 80s. So there's a lot of computer conferences and some super interesting transcripts that still exist, where you see like kind of representatives from all three of the camps, all presenting at some of the conferences. And there's some really interesting historical stuff that still does exist from that time, which I suggest people look into if they are interested.
Yeah, I mean, so much going on here. We got the motto, cypherpunks write code. And we'd be remiss if we didn't tie in, someone going through a terribly tragic, legendary hero's journey at the moment. A story about Silk Road and how that ties into all of this.
Yeah, that's probably one of the connections to Bitcoin that is not as obvious, but yeah, so Ross Ulbricht was probably one of the first people that saw the revolutionary nature of Bitcoin and how it could be used as a tool of self-sovereignty. And he created the Silk Road website, which was in essence just a libertarian platform that allowed people to buy and sell whatever they wanted, without laws there. And the currency that they used was Bitcoin. But before Silk Road really was anything, it didn't even have its first product, So as Ross was kind of dreaming this up and thinking about it, he had to come up with his first product. And what a lot of people don't know is that the very first product on Silk Road was psychedelic mushrooms. And they're psychedelic mushrooms that Ross actually grew himself so that he could put them on the Silk Road and they can actually be the first things that were sold. So there's this extremely deep connection between Bitcoin and psychedelics that pretty much goes back to the beginning. Because when you look at what transactions there are for Bitcoin, everybody knows about the pizza. So there's the pizza that was sold for the 10,000 Bitcoin. And there may be a couple other things. I know some people are selling some paper cups and some paper towels and things like that on Bitcoin Talk. But pretty much one of the first things that was ever transacted for Bitcoin was psychedelic mushrooms. So again, we see these connections that are intertwined in an unentangleable manner.
Right. And to, also of note, you mentioned that the first place Ross advertised the Silk Road was on a psychedelic mushroom online forum called the Shroomery under the username Altoid. You can still read his one and only post, and you put the link here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another interesting thing is that the place that he advertised the Silk Road. So one of the first advertisements for the Silk Road ever, it's kind of like one of those historical things. People go on tourist, like, hey, we're going to take a tourist tour through Miami or whatever. So you can actually take a tourist tour through the internet and see today Altoids post on the Shroomery still advertising the Silk Road. And I do think that that's an interesting piece of Bitcoin history for people to go check out. So you guys got to check out that link. And yeah, it's kind of one of those forgotten pieces, but it's still out there for anybody to visit today.
Right. I want to read a little more from your work. So, a Bitcoin node is a source of truth, a complete history from the now, all the way back to the Genesis. By running your own node, you empower yourself to obtain your own direct source of truth, unmediated by banks, politicians, or priests. For Bitcoin, this allows users to know with certainty that their own transactions are valid and real. No need to melt down a gold bar to verify using expensive equipment and time. If the Bitcoin arrives in my wallet, I know it's 100% real. It's not counterfeit. It's not debased. It is pure, unadulterated Bitcoin. With psychedelics, you can similarly grow, synthesize, and/or extract your own, removing the need for middlemen or concerns over purity, weight, and misidentification. Psychedelics allow you to, as Sama Katharo coined it, connect to your own inner node. The software running the wetware of the most complex and densely ramified processing machine known to man, your mind. You can use them to distill your own source of inner truth. You can explore the vast mindscapes within your head without any need for a psychiatrist or other trusted third party to interfere or project their frame of reference onto you. Psychedelics give you the keys to your own inner palace. And while running a full-scale psychedelic laboratory is outside the abilities and desires of most of the population, almost all adults can take control of their psychedelic path and grow their own mushrooms, cacti, and cannabis. Of course, there's various legal ramifications in various jurisdictions, and each user has to decide accordingly. So, what are maybe some of the known, or I'll name some of the known psychedelics? You got LSD, MDMA, mushrooms, DMT. You mentioned cacti here, cannabis. What are research chemicals?
So research chemicals are actually an interesting phenomenon. They're kind of a lesser known branch of psychedelics, and most of these stem from a researcher named Alexander Shulgin, who he's passed on now, but in the 80s he published some books, two books actually that kind of covered a spectrum of different psychedelic analogs. So these are things that were kind of based on the molecular structure of either LSD or mescaline, and these are two relatively different branches, tryptamines and phenethylamines. So those two branches, he kind of created a cookbook almost for each one of those, and there's about 152 different variations. And within that cookbook, he would kind of test them out all himself with a little group of his friends. So maybe like 10 or so different people. They would test them out and they would start low and kind of go high. And so these books were not only a cookbook, but they would also be like an experience. They say, hey, this is what this one does, and this is how it feels. And because he created all these interesting, weird variations of psychedelics, other people started to realize that, hey, like you could in essence just start modifying different molecules, and it will actually create different feelings in the way that you experience the world. So there's a whole branch of research chemicals that kind of spun off of Shulgin's initial research, and some of these things are not well researched and not well understood, and some of them are more dangerous than others. So not every psychedelic is as safe as we were talking about before, in the sense that you have like a very low profile of deaths, like a zero with your LSDs and your psilocybins. There are some psychedelics, something called like NBOME. There was a 25I series of NBOMEs, and these things were actually killing people at doses that were just kind of like 1 or 2. And these were extremely dangerous because they were almost like a counterfeit LSD. It was like a substance that was potent enough that you could fit it on an LSD blotter, and people were misrepresenting it and selling it as LSD. So people didn't know that they weren't taking LSD and they were actually taking one of these research chemicals, and that didn't have the same profile. So these are some of the dangers inherent in having a system where you have something that's illegal, in quotes, I'm saying, because now you have the government saying like this, perfectly safe thing is illegal. So people go to try to find other weird things. And in fact, it's actually much more dangerous and now killing people. So these weird ramifications that are a consequence of nonsensical regulation.
Yep, I can see that. And Eric Kayson's been on the show twice, examined truth and law and um, all different frameworks of authority. He's also just a very deep and intense philosopher. He said, and you quoted him, coming to a deep understanding of Bitcoin is very much like a deep psychedelic trip because everything seems to transform around this ideal in a way that's very unexpected and quite radical. Because now you are seeing things in a way that is quite different from the way you originally thought you were seeing them. And with there's this concept of finality that we have to think about here. There is no point of return with both psychedelics and Bitcoin. You go on to write, once you send a Bitcoin transaction, there's no taking it back. Once you click send and it is confirmed by the network, no action you take can stop that Bitcoin from moving once. When you place a hit of LSD on your tongue or eat a few grams of mushrooms, you are committed to the experience for the next several hours. There is no control Z, do-overs, or take-backs. There is no way out but through. So now, you're at the precipice, and I'm going to ask a bunch of rhetorical questions here, that one might think about on Bitcoin or psychedelics, which lead to these questions. So, what is time? What is money? What is real? What is language? What is work? What is energy? Is using energy good or bad? Where do I fit in among my peers? Why do these two different technologies bring us to the same fundamental questions about reality? And what is it to be human? Why do they inspire us to ask the big questions? The concept of time is deeply enmeshed in Bitcoin and psychedelics on multiple levels. Bitcoin has reimagined timekeeping, and the implications of this are yet to be understood. The human experience of time is variable. We interpret time through a lens of other perceptions. For instance, if you're having fun, time may seem to go fast, while when you're desperately waiting for something, it can feel like every second is an eternity. So, what is time like on psychedelics?
Time on psychedelics is very similar to time on Bitcoin in the sense that it's not really related to clock time. So the time that we're used to, it kind of ticks by moment, but the way we experience it is actually different. Now, psychedelics kind of hyper extend that. So I tend to think that it actually makes time go slower in the sense where you feel like you have that same sense where time is really taking a long time to move from 1 minute to the next, rather than the opposite where when your time is having fun and it's kind of moving very quickly. I find that it does the opposite, which to me the value of that is that it makes your life longer. Like if you think about it, if time is moving slower and you're fitting more experience into the same amount of time, like you're actually like making your life richer and like increasing the amount of life that you have.
Right. I hear what you're saying there. So, I want to get a little bit more into integration, and I want to know what your thoughts are on just maybe alcohol in general, and then integrating alcohol into these sort of implementations, because regardless of maybe how you feel about alcohol or how it might go and the pros and cons of that, I think a lot of people, especially maybe either younger or even just recreationally, might be integrating alcohol into these experiences.
Oh, this is a great question. Um, I I do use alcohol in the sense that I have wine sometimes. I also drink whiskey. But with psychedelics, I don't usually combine those two. I tend to much more commonly combine cannabis with, well, pretty much that. I tend to use cannabis throughout the day, but alcohol, alcohol affects me in a different way in the sense that alcohol kind of slows my mind down and I use it extremely selectively. Like if I know I'm not going to be reading anything for the evening, or if I know I'm not going to be doing anything for the evening, then I'll know I can kind of have some alcohol. But if I like want to do stuff, then I might go to the LSD side of things, like where I like, okay, I know I'm going to get shit done. So like they're totally different and I don't really find them compatible, but I do find it interesting that you bring up that a lot of other people probably do. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You just have to understand that what you're doing is you're modulating the experience in some way, whether you use cannabis, like I kind of said that I do, or alcohol or any other substance, like you're going to just be modulating the experience. And that's not necessarily bad or good. It may be actually fine for your personal body chemistry. And maybe that's like totally okay for you. But alcohol tends to be just very strong for me. So like, I don't do too well with it, so I don't have it super often, but I'm not really against it necessarily. It's just not one of, like, for me, it just takes me in the opposite way of how I usually want to feel, but sometimes it's just very appropriate. So I
Right.
guess it's both.
Right on. And, maybe about inexperience versus experience use, maybe how does that interplay into this? And maybe thinking about sort of maybe wanting to retain your insights or, action plans from the experience.
Right. That's probably one of the most important things is, if you're going to go into one of these experiences, like how are you going to kind of integrate this later on? And there's really no two ways about it, where I was saying experience use and inexperience use. You kind of can't get to the experience level until you've been in experience for a little bit. So I think sometimes you have to work your way through it to find the way that you can personally leverage it best. But for me, certainly, it's extremely easy now, because like I don't have that experience where, oh, I have this great epiphany and I totally lost it. Like, no, I'm pretty great at like noting when I have an okay idea and at least trying to sketch it out, or try to save it, or if nothing else, then I'm okay with losing it. But I definitely think that integrating it is probably the main important thing from the psychedelic experience, because you can go and have the experience and that's valid in and of itself, that you just kind of go outside of your normal experience for a while. But I think the real value to you is kind of not just in that moment, or in that say few hours that you're on the psychedelic, but actually, like, how does that transform the rest of your life kind of going forward from there? And the way to kind of find out that best is, I think, through just kind of repeated use, and there's just no way around that. It's just that you kind of have to use these things over and over again. And just like Bitcoin, it's like kind of, you learn it each time you use it, and by using it more, you get a little better and more comfortable at it. The first time it's really scary, like if you send a Bitcoin transaction, you don't know, like, did I send this to the right address? And I actually sent a whole Bitcoin to the wrong address once in 2015, like back in those days and stuff. So like, yeah, did I send this to the right place? And like, you're very unsure about this, and like, you don't know what you're doing. And the only way to become comfortable is just to kind of like get yourself through that and just do it a couple times in a way that you're comfortable with, and then you gain this adeptness through doing that. But I definitely think that would be the goal for anybody using psychedelics, would be just to figure out how they could leverage it. And I mean, certainly, I think there's just no way around that. Like, probably as you're just first starting to discover psychedelics, you will have those epiphany moments that you'll lose the next day. You'll kind of figure out the whole meaning of life and everything at night, and then the next morning you'll just scratch your head and try to figure out what what that was. But I definitely think, like, over time you begin to kind of figure a way that you can actually access that, and then really kind of use that to transform yourself and your experience with the world, and also sometimes maybe translate it in a way that it's valuable to others and they can see it as well.
Right. And you go on to write, benefits, discoveries, and inventions can manifest in a spark of inspiration, only to be forgotten and lost forever just moments later. Some users experience changes after a psychedelic experience, but they are short-lived. They'll gain insight and make changes. But like many New Year's resolutions, these quickly fade into entropy. The changes last a few weeks, maybe a month, but soon users find themselves falling back into the routine of daily life, and bad habits that were identified and addressed come back. The return of the mundane and the imposition of the world on our habits can be a powerful force. Psychedelics and the insights from Bitcoin's first principles thinking can be powerful, but need to be reinforced. This reinforcement can take the form of direct action, deep study, or force of will. But I believe that returning to the source of the experience is also essential. For Bitcoin, this means listening to podcasts, learning, coding, building, and sharing. For psychedelics, this means you need to revisit the psychedelic experience periodically. There is no magic bullet. You would not expect a single dose of aspirin to give a lifetime of pain relief, and psychedelics are the same. They work for a while, but they should be administered as needed. Maybe kind of like DCA. And so in kind of this regard, I think I'm a little bit about confidence building, because you mentioned earlier in the show that, going through a psychedelic experience, especially a tougher one, maybe more honest, exploration of yourself, could be difficult, and going through that can lead to confidence. Do some people experience a death rebirth experience, and is that life affirming?
I definitely think that it's pretty well documented that some people will have a death and rebirth experience on psychedelics. I don't think it's super common that people have that, but it's definitely something that happens over and over for people. And most of the cases that are documented, those are always like a positive story in the end, usually very transformative. But the hero, like any psychedelic, I think is in some way a little bit of the hero's journey. It's a little bit of you kind of going into the unknown. You're kind of taking a risk and bringing yourself, you're going on this adventure that you don't know where it's going to take you. And once you're committed, you're going on this adventure and you go through it. And, it's emotional and it takes you through the ringer, and, it brings you to all these places. And in essence, I think like each person goes through this. And when you come out the other side, whether it was difficult or whether it was good, it builds a little sense of confidence, like, hey, I went through this, I was able to do it, it was no problem. And I'm even stronger because of that. And I think that confidence building is something that mentally there's no other way to build that confidence except for going through that experience. And I think Bitcoin is very similar in the way that you can have these experiences. And actually I lost my thread there, but
No worries. So what is harm reduction?
Oh, well, harm reduction is like the psychedelic version of Bitcoin only, I think, in a sense. Like harm reduction is usually it's people that are in the psychedelic scene, and they kind of are there to make it as safe as possible for other people. So there's a whole harm reduction movement in essence, and these people will set up tents at raves and they will test people's drugs and see if they're actually legitimately ecstasy or maybe some other weird thing or LSD or whatever it is. They'll just test and say yes, you have something real, or no. And this is like save people's lives, because some people have maybe some kind of substance that literally is like poison or something, or fentanyl, or who knows what it was, and they could just overdose and die. So harm reduction is these people that are taking their own time, they're going out to these places, they're putting in their work, and they're actually doing good to just help other people so that they don't harm themselves. And in Bitcoin, we have the same kind of immune system where it's like the anti-shitcoiners, like people that are just literally, it's no benefit to them to tell you don't buy shitcoins. Like it doesn't help us at all to tell you don't buy shitcoins. It helps you, so it's like I find harm reduction to be kind of the psychedelic version of that. So those are kind of very, to me, I think those people are all good. It's good to have people in the scene that are actually out there kind of just be, it's in essence, it's kind of taking care of your own, the people that are like, we don't need regulators. We take care of our own. I think it's that kind of that ethos.
Yeah. And your article mentions that you made harm reduction blotter art to help combat this deceptive technique. And it notes that 25I-NBOME is often falsely sold as LSD, but this substance is highly toxic and has killed multiple users, unlike LSD, which has never killed anyone. Kind of, it's kind of be careful who you deal with. And, maybe if you can cultivate or grow your own or whatever you need to do to kind of eliminate middlemen. At one point, you wrote the most important takeaway from kind of this part of the talk, or if not the whole conversation, is keep your focus on Bitcoin in the world of cryptocurrency, and LSD and psilocybin in the world of psychedelics.
I think the thing I want to bring up with the harm reduction blotter art that I did there, because this is an important distinction. The blotter art was made because the research chemicals are research chemicals. So you have people that are legitimately interested in just testing some weird psychedelics, and they just want to find out what it is. And there's actually nothing wrong with that. I don't fault those people at all. What I do fault is people that would take those research chemicals and then sell them and misrepresent them as LSD to unsuspecting people. So the reason I made this blotter art was because because this NBOME substance was potent enough to put on blotter, and people were putting it on classic LSD blotter sheets and getting it confused. Because if you have a sheet that's got a couple thousand hits on it, even if the person is super honest that made it, if it's getting kind of distributed around, somebody may tell somebody else it's LSD or something like that. It's gonna the information is hard to find. So I actually put the paper has it on every single hit, so like it can't be misidentified. Like it actually says what it is. So if somebody gets a hold of this blotter, in essence, they won't be fooled. There's nothing wrong with doing MBOME if you want to do it, and like that's like your thing, but you should never be like given that when in essence you were told it's something else. So that's kind of the harm reduction ethos, is just that. So that was when I made that blotter art. It was with that in mind, that people could do what they want, but it shouldn't be misrepresented. So here's kind of a carrier that you can use to do this right for people that do it right. And you still see that blotter art today. I looked it up not too long ago, and I like, it's like I open sourced it, so people didn't have copied it and reprinted it, and it's still out there, which I do find like helpful and useful. It's like I haven't even thought of it in a decade, but it's still out there doing its thing.
Awesome. I want to read a little bit more to round out your piece here.
Yeah.
With Bitcoin, we transmute the fiat structures of the world into a digital cryptographic treasure that can teleport anywhere on the planet. This is performed like a magic spell by using specific words in the correct order. If you run the code, it works. By using the right words in the right sequence, we can make material changes in the world. These aren't just changes in our minds. These are changes others can see, feel, and independently verify. The right computer code can lift a drawbridge or change all the city's traffic lights in perfect timing to ensure drivers can safely transit roads. Bitcoiners are magicians and wizards using computer code rather than spell books. Psychedelic chemists are wizards casting their spells in the language of atoms. Like letters forming words in code or a magic spell, atoms are arranged to form molecules. Psychedelics transmute fiat thinking and living into new perspectives and mystical experiences. Mushrooms are like nature's alchemist, transforming dead and decaying matter, literal trash, and into psychedelic mushrooms, one of nature's most elegant manifestations. Bitcoin can also transmute waste into treasure. Stranded energy, once a burden, is transformed into a digital gold mine through Bitcoin. Bitcoin can even transform our landfills into valuable Bitcoin mines, turning trash into treasure. The alchemic dream is coming true in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. It's really a fascinating topic here. I hear you. What about AI?
I hated myself enough.
What has been your impressions so far? And is this a tool of self-sovereignty in any way?
Oh, I think AI is actually a very interesting tool. I think the incarnations that we have right now are very interesting because we're starting to see a whole bunch of advances. And I think AI is a tool that's very similar to LSD in the sense that they're very imprecise by nature. So how I was saying before, that you can kind of set yourself up with a, very proper set and setting, and you can dose yourself in a certain way to hope for, kind of set yourself up for best results, but you kind of never know what's going to happen. It's like an imprecise thing, and, it could go anywhere, and you just have to be cool with that. But like AI is very similar. You have to understand that it does these amazing things, and it can give you amazing insights and it can show you perspectives that you just didn't have, and it can really key off on things that are interesting, connections that you didn't make before. But you have to understand that it lies, and it's also, and not purposely, but it's just wrong a lot, and it's just super imprecise. Like, you can't trust it, is the thing. So it's like a really cool search engine that you can use, and either for visual or for text. Like, I find it super cool to use for both. Now, whether they're tools of self-sovereignty or not is totally up for debate, because right now you have the open AI, which is kind of using the GPT-4 and the Chat GPT, which are very powerful, and a lot of people, I've used them and stuff. But the problem with those is that you're kind of tied into the WorldCoin model, which is super dystopian, and like, you're kind of feeding data into this monster, and it's not self-sovereign at all. But there are people that are kind of building, not kind of, there are people that are building disconnected versions that you do kind of run in a self-hosted manner. And certainly with the visual tools, you have things like Stable Diffusion, that's totally, I think that's open source. And I think there's some AI tools that are also open source, and I think those are probably the best ones. And as far as being tools of self-sovereignty, I would imagine they are, but it's probably a tricky fine line that we just have to be very aware of and very careful with. I've been having a lot of fun with it because it's really interesting in terms of being able to generate interesting ideas on a path that you're already on. So you can kind of, I've been having fun with recent update to Midjourney where it has a feature called describe, and it will just, you could give it an image and it will just tell you what it thinks it is. And it gives you some buttons you can click and it will say, okay, it gives you 4 choices of how it would describe your picture. And then you can click those 4 buttons and it'll give you pictures that kind of should be what your picture is. But it never is what your picture is because it's AI and it's super weird and imprecise. But I've been feeding it pictures of my own art and then having it give me pictures of like weird AI versions of my own art. And it's been super helpful because it gives me really interesting shape ideas that I might not have had, but maybe I would have had if I was a different version of me. So I do find that there's really interesting ways to use these tools, and we just have to be conscious about what kind of data that we're releasing and what kind of data we're feeding into the machine when we are using these tools. But I do find that they're extremely interesting to leverage. I think the least interesting way to use like the AI tools like ChatGPT and stuff is to try to make them say something controversial or something like, oh, what do you think about something controversial? Like that's really almost a waste of your time. Like why do you want to like have a controversial chat with an AI? Like I think it's much better to try to make it do something, like almost make it your employee in a sense. Like what's something that you would want to do that you don't really, or something that you need to do that you don't want to do, and you can kind of offload some of that to it and it actually will do it for you. And it does it pretty all right-ish in the sense that you can kind of like, you just understand that it's pretty crappy and you just have to go back and clean it up a little. And there's some potential there. So I think it's just like anything else. It's a tool, it can be improperly used, it can be properly used. And you just have to kind of measure where you are personally in it. But something we all have to kind of contend with now, just like Bitcoin and LSD. This is technology that exists. You know, how do you fit it into your life?
Right. Integration, evolution, and learning. It's not easy. Yeah. Learning is fun, though. I've enjoyed this conversation immensely, Fractal. This has been so dope. My final question to you, before we roll out, is if you could orange pill any artist in the world, dead or alive, who would you orange pill?
Oh, wow. That's a crazy question. Man, orange pill any artist? I don't know. Man, well, I mean, honestly, like there's a lot of great artists that it would be interesting to orange pill, but there's some old clockmakers from the 1500s that to me would actually be really interesting to orange pill, in the sense that these people were kind of some of the pioneers in making the original planetary models that are called orreries and things of this nature. I think those people would be very, very intrigued to learn about like the natures and the patterns inside Bitcoin. And I'd like to kind of see what these like old school clockwork guys would kind of come up with that, because I think we'd be a cool conversation for the evening.
That's awesome. Fair enough. So I'll leave it to you for any parting words and to let people know where they can find you, and your awesome work.
Oh, right on. Cool. Thanks, man. Well, I'm on Twitter, so you can find me on Twitter at Fractal Encrypt. I also have a website, timechainartifacts.com. But mostly I'm on Twitter if you want. If you reach out, I'm always happy to chat about stuff.
Yeah, and I think I'll definitely have to have you back to talk about the time chain codex.
Yes, there's definitely more to chat about. I really appreciate this. This was so much fun to actually get into the article and go through a lot of this, because it was super enjoyable. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. Yo, that's a wrap on today's episode of the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. We hope you found it informative and engaging. I'd like to take a moment to thank our listeners for tuning in and supporting us. I couldn't do it without you. If you're interested in supporting the show, there are a few ways you can do so. You can leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform, which helps us reach a wider audience. You can also stream the show on the Fountain app and boost it for sats. And finally, we're always looking for sponsors who align with our values and mission. If you're interested in partnering with us, please reach out to me directly at cedricyoungelman@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Bitcoin Matrix podcast.